Okay.
Hey guys, hello.
Okay.
Thank you for being with us today. My name is Ophir. This is Daniel. We'll present ourselves soon. Our talk today is named Conclusions from Tracking Server Attacks at Scale. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we mean when we say server attacks and how these attacks look in high level. So let's dig in. Server attacks are any attack that targets a server machine as opposed to endpoints such as personal computers, laptop, mobile phones. Server machines can be anything from web servers, database servers, orchestration servers, etc. Why do these machines make a good target for attackers? So first of all, these attacks are usually very automated and they require zero user interaction. Second of all, server machines, as you probably can assume, they have very long uptime. This means that attackers have very high chances of reaching an active machine. Server machines have exactly what attackers are looking for. So if we're talking about a lot of CPU power, this is a great basis for crypto mining and cryptojacking. If we're talking about large bandwidth, then this means better and more efficient DDoS attack. If we're talking about storage, server machines usually have a lot of valuable data that attackers can steal, send to their command and control servers, and later on sell to other attack groups. And last but not least, server machines are sometimes those neglected machines within the organization. They run old operating systems. They don't have security patches installed. Sometimes they're even exposed to the internet where really they don't have any reason to be. And all these reasons make them a really good target for attackers to concentrate on. Now let's see how these attacks look like from beginning to end. When an attacker wants to initiate an attack campaign, they first need to locate the machines on the internet that run the vulnerable services. These can be MSSQL, SMB, MySql, and the relevant port numbers that appear respectively in the slide. To locate these machines on the internet, the attackers perform simple port scanning. And what we see is that some of the times they use open source tools like Nmap or Masscan, which are publicly available, but they also sometimes write their own proprietary port scanners to integrate with their other modules. Once they find these machines on the internet, they need to exploit the vulnerable services, and they do this usually in one of two methods, either vulnerability exploitation or simple credential brute force. So with vulnerability exploitation, what we see a lot is lately the eternal blue exploits that we've heard of in the previous talk. We're seeing eternal blue exploitations implemented in Python, in PowerShell, in many languages. This is still very active today. We also see old web vulnerabilities like Oracle struts and PHP-MyAdmin, and many more. But also, as I mentioned, credential brute force is a very preferred method for attackers. Once the machine is exploited, the attackers are in the organization, and at this point, at the post-infection phase, what they usually do is fetch additional payloads. These can be the DDoS modules, more malware, crypto miners, and sometimes these attackers decide to propagate and move laterally within the organization. Why? Because they need as many machines infected as possible, so they just try to move laterally within the organization and get as many server machines as they can. Good. So we at Guardicore, where we work, we see a lot of these attack campaigns, and we have a very large data set that Daniel will describe later on. And this is a very nice basis for us to ask some very interesting questions. So for example, who are the attack machines that are responsible for the major attacks in the internet? Where did they come from? Which countries, which ISPs host these attack machines? How long do these attack machines live? How long do they operate? Once the attackers are on the infected machines, where do they go outbound? Which machines do they try to connect to? We're going to try and answer some of these questions. Of course, there's a lot to ask and research here. There's a lot of future work to be done. which I think will be fascinating. So the agenda for us today, we covered server attacks in short. Next, Daniel will present the data set that we worked with. And the main part will be present to you our findings from our data analysis, the questions and answers, and also some anecdotal campaigns that we uncovered in Guardicore to show you some real-life examples. Finally, we'll conclude. We'll have some amusing anecdotes as well regarding attacker behavior. And yeah, we'll wrap it up. So now to present ourselves a little more thoroughly, my name is Ophir. I'm a security researcher in Guardicore, where Daniel is my boss and enjoys throwing tasks at me. I love reverse engineering, binaries, malware, whatever, and also a big Twitter addict. You're very invited to follow if you want. Daniel.
Yep. So I'm Daniel, as Ophir introduced me. After a decade in security, I call myself a security jack of all trades, and somehow still a hopeless Windows fanboy despite the mess that is that operating system. In 2 sentences briefly about where we work, Guardicore is a cloud and data center security company. The buzzwords is like we do microsegmentation visibility. What this means in practice is we built a distributed firewall for virtual machines and optimized for servers. Enough about that. Let's talk a bit about the data and the research that we actually performed. So our idea was, let's look at what's happening in attacks on the internet. If you just put a machine online, what actually happens to it? We all know it at a very high level, what Ophir described, and we decided to take a closer look at what actually happens here. The core idea we had was, let's put a lot of honeypots and to the internet and see what happens. But to do this in a slightly sophisticated manner. What we did was the idea that we want to route publicly accessible IPs to machines we control, basically setting up a server that's exposed to the internet on all the ports, block all of them, and then dynamically redirect the traffic to virtual machine honeypots that we generate every few minutes. This means that if somebody's scanning the internet looking for MySql servers, we're going to say, hi there, this is a MySql server, and give him a honeypot that's a MySql server. If he does that for SSH, he gets the same service. The problem is that just connecting to a machine doesn't mean that you can break into it. Attackers need to somehow break in. And most people are not going to spend their strong vulnerabilities online. So what we wanted to do was to create virtual machines with vulnerable services. For example, old PHP MyAdmin, a popular content management system, or unpatched Windows boxes still vulnerable to the Eternal Blue vulnerability from 2 years ago, and so forth. Another thing we did was we patched SSHD and the SMB service so that after a few attempts, the attackers are just going to break in. That means they're going to try administrator, password 1, root, admin, and on the 4th try, they're in. Okay, once inside, what do we want to know? So, before that, we did this, spread around 400 or so publicly accessible IPs. We partnered with a large European hosting company to take 30 IPs from there. A large regional university gave us an unused Class C to divert to our honeypots. We bought 60 IPs from one of the large cloud vendors, and just took the corporate credit card and bought IP ranges in different data centers in the US and Europe. This gives us a pretty good snapshot of what's going on in the West. And once we did that, we decided to take a look at what's actually going on. So basically, what's our honeypot capable of doing? So like pretty much any other sandbox, we monitor for process events, process creation, command lines, environment variables, and so forth. We run full packet capture of all incoming and outgoing traffic to monitor. But we take a closer look, for example, at what all DNS queries going outside of that box go through to a name server under our control. We also track all file and registry events, such as file saves, modifications, queries. We want to know everything the attackers did. All this is typical for many sandboxes. We also went a step further and wrote application-specific hooks to look into activities on database servers, for example, database queries, or PowerShell blocks that were executed, or user password modifications, and so forth. We went pretty wild on that. This is a very partial list of all the custom hooks we implemented. For example, we keep track of user operations like which group modifications, as I mentioned before, DNS resolutions, schedule task creations, and we run the entire pcap file through a Yara rules engine to just see what other people were going to pick up. So we cover pretty much everything that happens inside the box, but there are important limitations. We cover a bunch of operating systems, my mistake. You can see here Windows Server 2003, 2012 R2, and Ubuntu 14.04. These are not the latest and greatest operating systems, and this was deliberate. We wanted to cover the operating systems that we expect to see unmaintained in the internet, not fully patched, not maintained properly, and see what attackers do to these machines. Also, besides the typical obvious services such as SMB, FTP, remote desktop, we also exposed in a Hadoop yarn configuration, Windows remote management, Telnet, and we pretty much try to figure out what attackers are going to look for and give them that to see. Some limitations to our research to keep in mind in our conclusions. I mentioned 400 or so routed IPs, but this number changes over time, depending on budget. Same with the number of honeypots we have. This means we basically have limited resources compared to the internet, and that means aggressive attackers are overrepresented. If, for example, we sample only 1 in every 10 connections, then people who are constantly trying to break in through our front door are more likely to be recorded than the 1 in a million who has a really cool technique. Additionally, not all IP ranges are created equal. For example, we discovered that one of our IP ranges was predominantly targeted around Windows. So Windows results a lot more popular in our dataset than we know that exists in the real world, according to scanners like Showdown and Census. And okay, with that in mind, let's actually look into what we actually discovered here. We ran this experiment for roughly 2 years and started crunching the numbers recently. And this means roughly 2 million or so unique attack incidents. We start out from the very basic question of just how dominant are top attackers, meaning those noisy people who are constantly trying to break into everything, every IP they see. We want to track just how dominant are they and is blacklisting their IPs really relevant? The technique was simple. Let's count the attack incidents per attacker IP, sort by a descending number, and fetch the top attacker IPs. And we did that. We took the first 100 of our results, counted the number of attacks from them, and divided by the number of overall attacks we saw. And the first result was pretty cool. 1% of all source IPs, all attacker IPs, are responsible for 35% of all security incidents. This sounds like it would be a great idea to just take this list of 1% of these IPs and just blacklist them and significantly reduce the noise we're seeing in our firewall logs, in access logs, and leave time to focus on more interesting threats. But we are skeptical, and we checked just how stable these numbers are, and we reran them just for the top 3 months in the last summer. The results are a bit less useful. 13% of attackers are responsible for 35% of attack incidents. This is still interesting because those are not that many IPs. We're talking about 200 that if you block a significant fraction of their all their attacks. This does mean if you want to use blacklists, you're going to have to update them over time. Okay, somebody's going to figure solve. Hold on. Okay, let's just move to using this. This doesn't mean you want to rely on blacklists. Okay, we'll work with what we got. If this doesn't mean if you want to rely. And yeah, this does mean if you want to rely on blacklists, then you're going to have to keep updating your blacklists not every half year, but pretty much every week or so. We also decided to take a look at where these attackers come from, which geographically and ISP level. So geographically, we ran all these IPs through a commercial geolocation map if you're curious. And no big surprise on the top three. The United States, China, and Russia are the most popular sources of botnet attacks. It's more surprising to look at Vietnam, which is somehow our fourth result. And we're not exactly sure since when is Vietnam a cybercrime powerhouse here. There's not much we can do about attacks coming from China and Russia, but there is a lot we can do about attacks coming from the US. And we decided to take a closer look at what ISPs are responsible for attacks in the US. And in the top 5, we see large hosting companies such as Colo Crossing and DigitalOcean. No surprise that such ISPs would be used and also abused by attackers. But also some names such as NU and that are pretty surprising to see, and we're not exactly sure who's using these ISPs and why are we accepting traffic from them. We're primarily responsible for spreading malware online. It's an interesting question just how often these attacks happen and how long they. For example, if you're spreading attacks from DigitalOcean, what? Let's see if now this works. Yeah. Okay. Technical problems are fun. So it's an interesting question just how long. If you take a if you take a server from DigitalOcean and start attacking, does anybody stop you? If, for example, you compromised some machine that's hosted in an ISP, are you blocked or not? And we want to take a closer look into this. An interesting question we started by asking was, how do we even find and count these? A naive approach would be to take each attacker's first seen and last seen timestamps and subtract. This is problematic for 2 reasons. One, in these large hosting companies, IPs are frequently reused, and an IP that would be used by one server, the server is decommissioned. 2 months later, an IP is reused again, and we might count it as a single consecutive sequence. Not good enough. Additionally, a popular event that happens in malicious circles is you take over a machine, the sysadmin notices it, kicks you off, but doesn't block the way you entered the machine, and 2 months later, you're infected again. We would like to consider these as 2 different events. We needed to find a better solution. What we ended up doing was to take all the attacks timestamps per attacker IP, rounded to 1 week's resolution, and counted the number of consecutive weeks in this attack. So if a server spread around different attacks for 2 months, was cleaned up, attacked again a few weeks later, we're going to count these as separate events. Once we did that, we got the following results. This is the number of IP addresses per number of distinct weeks. We've seen these IPs in our sensors. You can see the very rapid drop-off of around 1 or 2 weeks, and then a very rapid drop. What this means is the vast majority of cases, if a machine is compromised, it's rapidly discovered and cleaned up, and somebody hardens the box again. But there's a very long tail, and the graph doesn't show it properly, but this keeps on going till the 40s and 50s, stabilizes around 25 weeks. And we feel comfortable stating that servers that we see very frequently attacking our honeypots are not just some server that somebody randomly took over, but dedicated machines hosted in an ISP that doesn't care, or machines that were compromised and the hosting provider doesn't notice that the machines were compromised. So next up, we looked at, as I mentioned before, the consecutive weeks. And here the graph looked similar, but I want to see the top level numbers for a change. And we see some attacks, some IPs are attacking us for week after week, nearly a year at a time. We took a look at the most active IPs, starting from the first one, and decided just to look what exactly is going on for so long at these machines. This is a screenshot from the public side of our Honeypot Providers. It's a website we'll talk about in the end. This ISP is from China, no large surprise there, from one of the larger ISPs. And It's a bit hard to see here. I'll take a closer look in a minute, that this targets MySql servers. Now, the title here is Swamanaru, and for those of us who are not keeping up with botnet news, and I don't blame you, Swamanaru is a long-running campaign over the last 3 years with many variants that's been covered by different security researchers. For example, Hexman, Mykings, and Swamanaru most lately. This botnet compromises machines using the Eternal Blue exploit and brute forces credentials on various services such as MySql databases, Telnet and IoT devices, remote desktops, and more. This botnet makes money by crypto mining Monero currency on compromised servers, using those machines for DDoS attacks, and selling access to different criminal groups. The attackers, in what will be a constant theme in this talk, left parts of their attack infrastructure wide open, allowing us to read their attack logs and collect information. We looked at it for a month, and we saw the following, some basic stats. Roughly 90,000 infections inside a single month from just scanning the internet and attacking. This came out to be roughly 5,000 infections per day. Interestingly, Swamanaru included a lateral movement component, like Ophir mentioned in the start, and we found more than 5,000 networks were infected after the attackers found an initially open host on the internet. As an anecdote, the largest network we saw compromised had 65 hosts. It was a small company in north of Italy. And as I mentioned before, many system administrators are not fools, and they do notice that they were attacked and somebody took over their machines. But many of them cleaned up the machines and didn't stop the vulnerability or exploit used to break in. And we found more than a quarter of the hosts were infected more than once during the course of this month. So system administrators are probably behind the scenes, oh, I found a virus, let's clean it up, but I'm not sure how it got in here, so let's keep on doing the same thing over and over again. I don't want to spend more time on this botnet because we wrote about it and other people wrote about it. You can read here or the slides will upload. And at this point, Ophir.
Thank you. Let's take 10 seconds to pray that my mic will work. Okay. So Daniel spent some time talking about the attackers, where they come from, how frequently they operate. Now I'd like to dig in a little bit more to the post-infection phase. What do they do after the attackers are on the machine? So as I mentioned before, they tend to communicate back to external servers like command and control, CNC, and file hosting servers that host malicious payloads, scripts that they need to run on infected machines, etc. And we figured that if we study this behavior, this post-infection behavior, maybe we can get to some more generalized indicators of compromise and manage to perhaps block malicious traffic performed from breached servers. So we look at the attacks that we have in our database, and we saw that 40% of the attacks included some kind of outgoing traffic. Where do the attackers go outbound anyway? So we see two main destinations. The first is servers that the attackers compromise, once again, to function as command and controls or host malicious files and malicious payloads. And the second destination, which is also pretty popular, is completely legitimate online services that the attackers abused to store malicious payloads. So as you can see, we see things like GitHub, Amazon S3 buckets, Discord channels used to host files, Bitbucket, and many others. Now, as you can see in the examples below, attackers use both IP addresses to connect back to their servers, but they also use domains, and we were interested in figuring out how often they use each one of those and whether they prefer one over the other. So just to talk a little bit about the considerations when choosing IPs or domains, when attackers or any other person chooses IPs, they get to be anonymous, right? No personal information is registered with this. The problems about IPs is that IP rotation is harder. So if an attacker wants to, for example, host their files on a different server than they started with, they will probably have to change many places in their infrastructure. So we're talking about hard-coded address or practically any place that points to the server. Also, when using IPs, encrypting the traffic is harder than we get with domains. With domains, we have SSL certificates, which makes encryption easier. Also, we have easier IP rotation because one single DNS record can resolve too many IP addresses. And we also gain another layer of redirection. The DNS resolution itself is good for attackers. The problems about domains is that they store personal information. You need to give organization address when you register a domain. And this information can be also backtracked. So we can see which IP addresses a DNS record resolved to over time. So let's dig into the data and see what attackers prefer. Apparently, when we look at file download operations, we see 2/3 of the cases attackers use IP addresses. So apparently they prefer being anonymous over the other benefits that domains give them. Only 1/3 of the file downloads are done with domain names. Another interesting question that we had is over which port numbers do attackers perform file downloads? And this is what we figured out. 95% of file downloads are done over traditional port numbers like FTP, HTTP, HTTPS, and traditional web ports like you can see in the list below. Only 5% is done with some bizarre port numbers like 777, 1234, you name all these weird port numbers. So this kind of means that we cannot block malicious file downloads only by blocking traffic to weird-looking port numbers. But I'd like to show some more comforting insight that we found. We decided to look at the domain names to which attackers communicate, and we listed all domain names that we see, and we counted how many times each one appeared in the dataset. And to be honest, we wanted to see which top-level domains were used by attackers. So we actually zoomed in on this part, on the TLDs. And this is what we found. So the topmost frequent top-level domains were .com and .net, but right after them appeared those TLDs that no one ever accesses, like PW, XYZ, CC. We don't think anything good comes from these top-level domains. I'm sorry if there are any residents of the Palau country, which PW stands for. So this means that blocking outgoing traffic from servers to these top-level domains will most likely block malicious traffic, which is a pretty nice fact. Okay, going back to the post-infection phase, we wanted to know how attackers persist on machines. I said that servers had long uptimes, but this doesn't mean they're never rebooted. And attackers do want to make sure that they survive reboots. So what do they choose to persist? I think we all know some very classical persistence methods. Here we see screenshots from Guardicore platform. We see the classical registry run key persistent method. Right after it, we see the creation of a user, a backdoor user, and how it's added to the administrators group to allow it for higher privileges on the machine. Lastly, we see an example from Linux machines where attackers choose to create SSH keys for persistence. And with regards to persistence methods, we actually had 2 questions in mind. This is a list of the persistence methods that we monitor in our honeypots. We had 2 questions in mind. The first one was how many methods are used within each attack? Do attackers use only one? Do they use all of them? And the second question was, what is the distribution? Like, what is the most popular method? What is the least popular method? And we'll see both answers now. So for the first question, we saw that 65%, the vast majority, uses only one method. This means that if this method is eliminated by some security product on the server machine, they don't have any persistence anymore. 33% of the attackers use exactly 2 persistence methods. This guarantees that even if one method is eliminated, they still persist on the machine. We see 2% of the attackers use more than 2 persistence methods from the previous slide. And we even see attackers use 8 different persistence methods in one attack, which is pretty interesting. So they kind of shoot in all directions. Okay, regarding the second question, what is the most popular? So I don't know if this is surprising or not. The registry run key is still the most popular among the attacks that we observe. Right after it, we have the WMI persistence. I don't know if all of you know it, so I'll give a quick explanation. This is a persistence method on Windows where attackers create a consumer object, which is the action to be performed, and they tie it with some event, some operating system event. This can be the timer, this can be logon, any other trigger. And this is how they can run their malicious processes when different triggers occur. So these are the biggest chunks in this pie chart, right? But to find the really interesting incidents, we wanted to look at the minority of the attacks. And we decided to look at the 1% of driver creations. So we simply listed all the drivers we see created and loaded in attack incidents. At the first place, you can see NPF. This is Net Packet Filter. It is very interesting, but it's well known. We decided not to concentrate on this. This driver is usually used when attackers want to either sniff the network on breached servers, or when they want to scan the network to propagate and to move laterally. The next driver on this list is what we actually found very interesting. This is SA6482. And this is a driver used in the Nanchu campaign that we uncovered around 5 months ago. So from a first glance, this may look like a regular crypto miner botnet. But actually, we found it pretty interesting because except the crypto miner, which is pretty regular, this attack group was using both a driver and 2 versions of Windows kernel exploits. Here you can see a screenshot once again from Guardicore platform. We can see how the attacker downloads and executes the Windows exploits and the loading of the driver. You can see the name that we saw before. What is so unique about a driver being used in a crypto mining attack? So recent versions of Windows require every driver which is loaded into kernel mode to be signed with a digital certificate. And for attackers to have such a certificate, they need to do one of 2 things: either steal a certificate or create some fake company and convince a certificate authority that they're worthy of a certificate. This is not a very trivial operation, and we thought we'd see it with higher-end attackers like nation states and more advanced attack groups. But apparently, even common criminals are getting ahead, and they're starting to use some advanced techniques. To get a better look at the driver that is used in Nanchu, we can see here the digital certificate. The company name, I'll read it for you, Hang Zehutia Network Technology. This is a non-existent company. They just made it up. And apparently, they made VeriSign give them this digital certificate. I'll spoil a little and say that the driver was used to protect the crypto mining process. So even a very aware user that saw this crypto miner running would not be able to just kill it because this driver would protect it using the process ID. Daniel promised that the open infrastructure is a repeating theme in this talk, and even Nanchu attackers left their infrastructure open for us to investigate, which I personally love. And we saw that during the time span of 1 month only, they doubled the number of infected machines they reached. And they basically reached almost 50,000 machines on the internet, running MSSQL servers and PHPMyAdmin. Daniel.
Great. So now we saw different persistence methods, but why do we need so many? And the reason comes back to that criminal groups are commercial enterprises that want to make money. And the malware space is just as competitive as many other sectors of the economy. And attackers need to find ways to stand out from each other in terms of how they take over machines. And the reason for that is simple. The internet is very large, but there's a large but limited number of vulnerable servers online. Each one is worth money. They can use these machines to make, whether by using them for cryptocurrency, by selling the access, ransomwaring the data. You can't just take over a box and get kicked out by the next attacker who wants to use it to mine Monero, or while you're mining cryptocurrency, have somebody come in and destroy the box by ransomwaring the data on it. So attackers are faced with the problem of, how do I block hostile takeovers? I got on a box, and how do I prevent that the next automated attack after me going to come in and kick me off? We've seen a variety of techniques used. I'm going to show a few of them now. First one is, let's block how you got in. If you got in, for example, using the Eternal Blue vulnerability over SMB, then what we see here is NetSH, Windows Firewall commands to block the SMB and RPC ports, and a few others I omitted from this listing. Basically meaning, I got in, nobody else gets in right after me. Let's bar the door. And a side effect from this is that defenders have a harder time of monitoring their boxes, because most monitoring tools still work over RPC or SMB to access the machine and collect information. So they not only blocked other attackers, but they also blocked the basic tool used by defenders. This is pretty neat, but most attackers go for something a lot simpler. This is just a very, very, very long task kill command that I cut out because it got way too long. And here you can see the attackers deleting, killing other crypto miners, other backdoors, other Trojans, registry editing tools, and pretty much everything they can think of that can cause problems for them. This is noisy, but it's effective. And if you kill this, then this is why attackers use persistence methods, or they leave backdoors in. So some attackers go the step further, and they're going to kill other users' backdoors, other criminal groups. What we see here is MySql commands to change the password of different users to this random jumble of letters. And the right side is, you can see SZ, SS, SE, and obviously this list was a lot longer. And these are usernames we found created by other criminal groups. And the reasons they picked these names is because in MySql, the system administrator user is SA, and these names sound familiar. So attackers end up pretty much competing over the same limited amount of servers. So as a short summary, we want to say that untargeted attacks are a lot more than just the Mirai lookalikes and ransomware worms we've been seeing the last few years, such as WannaCry or the classic DDoS botnets. They make money in multiple methods, though cryptocurrency is by far the biggest one. There's a large amount of determined actors working and developing infrastructure in this space, and there's a lot more victims than you think. We found little to no overlap between the two campaigns we presented here in the list of victims. There's pretty much millions of computers accessible online with really bad security. All the data that we presented here is available for free on a website we put up. You can go there, check any IP that we found in our collection, any domain. Just go right there and insert some IPs. If you have information, tell us about it. To end this talk on a bit of a lighter note, I'm going to let Ophir talk a bit about some mistakes we found.
I gotta first ask if someone tried the QR code and managed to... Yeah, it works? Okay, yay. I didn't test it. Where's my clicker?
Here.
Thanks. Okay, so the fun part, the mistakes that attackers make. First of all, Daniel described our honeypots, what service providers they have, what we can imitate. And it seems like attackers are expecting more than we can offer them. So for example, they're trying to run stuff like fetch, TFTP, curl, Docker, God knows why. Yeah, also they don't seem to check on which Linux distribution they're running on. So they're trying the yum package manager, where what we can actually give them is the apt package manager. Next, we need to remember that attackers are human beings as well. They have human errors, they have typos, they confuse sometimes, and we can see two examples here. So on the top, we see an invalid IP used to fetch the Windows exploit that I talked about before. This command will obviously not work. The attackers had to fix their script, and we actually saw this being fixed after a couple of days. Next on the slides, we see how they confuse command line parameters. Here, they're trying to run their crypto miner. This is actually the correct way of doing this, U being the wallet address to which we're mining coins, and the P parameter is the credentials used to connect to the pool. On the right is how they actually ran this command line, which is exactly the opposite of what they should. You have to understand that running the miner this way will not produce even a single dollar or, Bitcoin or Monero for these attackers. So this is completely useless. To wrap everything up, this is my favorite mistake of all, leaving the servers wide open for security researchers like ourselves to investigate. This is the Nanchu file server. Here they stored all their files, HTTP file server, HFS. As you can see, the full file listing of what the attackers were using, when each file was uploaded to the server, and how many times it was downloaded. And this is very nice. We monitored these numbers for about a month, and we actually got to find out how widespread this campaign was. This is the graph I showed you before. So yeah, these are some attackers' mistakes. And thank you so much for being with us. I hope you enjoy this talk. I think there's you. Can we take questions or later?
Yeah. Now's the time. Otherwise, we'll be in the speaker lounge. But if anybody has questions, we still have some time. Okay, so if anybody still wants to ask us but not up here, we'll be outside. Thank you very much.